Hello everyone, I'm Natalie Kunzman, MD, and what is the problem with insulin? Well, we're going to find out in functional medicine. There is always a sweet spot that we're looking for. So what does insulin do in the first place? Well, we need insulin to attach to the glucose molecule so that it can actually gain entrance inside the cell for its energetic uses at the cellular and at the nuclear level. So let's say you had no insulin whatsoever. This is what a type 1 diabetic goes through. And you have a lot of free-floating sugar and no insulin to attach to it to get it inside the cell for cellular functioning. So all the sugar is floating around in the bloodstream outside of the cell, and the cell is actually starving. So a type 1 diabetic will go through cellular starvation, and then of course the sugar will attract the water, so they wind up getting dehydrated. So that somewhat explains what insulin is used for and what would happen if we didn't have it. What we are noticing with the population getting more and more obese over time and more of the type 2 diabetes and metabolic dysfunction is that we're secreting too much insulin. And why would that happen? Well, the body is seeing a lot of excess storage, and it's seeing a lot more glucose, which comes from the carbohydrate family. It's seeing a lot more than it needs. So the cell can only, or I should say inside the cell, could only support so much glucose before it would explode from all the water entry and everything else that would happen from there. So we brilliantly are manufactured with insulin receptors on those cells so that there's only so many receptors on that cell that the insulin could attach to with that glucose to open the door and gain entry into that cell. So if there's so much excess sugar, those receptors initially will try to manufacture a few more to accommodate all the extra sugar, but it gets to a point where it's like, hold on, wait a minute, we have too much glucose. So those receptors that are already there start becoming less acceptable, or what we would call insulin resistance. So the insulin's trying to attach to those receptors, but the receptors are morphing and changing to a degree where the insulin can't get into the cell, open those channels and doors. So now, not only do we have glucose that's free floating around in the bloodstream, but the body is noticing that all this sugar's floating around, so it starts secreting even more insulin. Insulin is resistant and can't get to inside the cell. So now we have a lot of insulin floating around in the bloodstream. And this can be an absolute disaster because insulin of itself can cause problems because A, it'll increase cortisol, so it'll increase the stress response. It also, in and of itself, will behave as a growth molecule. So it starts adding fat deposition, particularly so in the truncal distribution. So we now have, again, too much of a good thing. So we can't live without insulin. We need a certain amount of insulin to process our daily glucose demands. But we also will wind up having chronic illness, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes with an insulin resistant picture where there's too much insulin in response to our body needs. And honestly, most of this is coming from supplying the body of excess. So again, maybe just simply to list, the risk factors determining this is obesity, kind of as the model I explained in the beginning. But an inactive lifestyle where you're not using that glucose, which is kind of like gasoline in the car. It's just sitting in the tank unless you run it. If a diet is high in carbohydrates, that makes a lot more sense because that is adding to the excess. Now, if you were a gestational diabetic, you're much higher risk of developing diabetes and insulin resistance in that future when you are non-pregnant. If there is fatty liver disease or polycystic ovarian syndrome, this also can lead to insulin resistance, and quite commonly so in our younger populations. If there is a family history of diabetes, that makes you higher risk to be inheriting a metabolism of carbohydrate failure, as I describe it. Smoking will actually increase your risk for insulin resistance, such as certain ethnicities, such as being Latino, Native American, or African. Those subsets have a much higher risk for insulin resistance. And then the whole world of functional medicine and some of these underpinnings would include a sleep disturbance such as sleep apnea, as it can make you insulin resistant. So what we are looking at in the blood work that might be highly suggestive of insulin resistance, and I can say this would be a blood work or signs that we would see on a patient, is if a male has a waistline of 40 inches or greater, if a woman has a waistline of 35 inches or greater, if the blood pressure readings are climbing, that in and of itself can make you much more pronounced to have an insulin resistant picture. If your fasting glucose is over 100, if your fasting triglycerides are over 150, if your HDL, remember in our previous lecture, which you can watch, HDL, which is that good lipoprotein, if that's lower than it should be, and in men it's under 40, and women it's under 50, that can make you a higher propensity for insulin resistance. And then there's some key factors that we will notice on the human body that are some telltale signs to go looking at elevated insulins, and that's skin tags or what we call acanthosis nigrans, which is a kind of a rough, scruffy looking brownish, blackish patches of rough skin. So again, it's very obvious that you would probably want to see what the insulin level is doing. Fasting has a lot more statistics under its belt, so we would want to see what a fasting insulin level is. And I will say that in the beginning phases of insulin resistance, the body is secreting more insulin than what is needed for the glucose that's around. And I view that almost as a ratio. And that ratio may be so disparate that a patient may feel hypoglycemic, may feel as though that sugar is too low. But in actuality, when you look at that insulin level has skyrocketed to try to meet the demands of that body. So what can we do about insulin resistance, well, boy, oh boy, if there is anything you've ever learned from my discussions, exercise is probably one of the key factors. You want to burn that glucose down. But also, we want a healthier diet that is not supplying us of all this glucose. And then, as we've learned, there are some pockets of people who have inherited a worse strategy or worse ability to process extra carbohydrates. We obviously want to maintain a healthy weight, which goes hand in hand with the exercise and the dietary intake. So we need to keep an eye out for those waistlines, since that is the metabolically active area that can create the insulin resistance. The dietary strategies should be much more of a paleo approach, for instance, where you have good proteins, whether they are animal or non-animal, low to no grains, and lots of vegetation and lots of fiber. What are the problems with insulin resistance? So who cares if that insulin level is high and you're putting some weight on? Well, the complications of insulin resistance and high insulin are some obvious ones, such as a heart attack, stroke, kidney disease, eye disease, cancer, Alzheimer's. And a lot of this is revolving around the fact that the red blood cell does not like to be sticky, and a sticky red blood cell with the extra sugar on that will cause a lot of capillary damage because it's sticky and adherent and traumatizing to the capillary bed. Now, all is not lost. If you are insulin resistant and some of these tactics are not enough to help you with the severity of your levels, of course we have medications to help with this. In functional medicine, we have several supplemental approaches to help gain the cells more acceptable and less insulin resistant. And then if the cat is out of the bag and you're diabetic, that is a discussion for another day. So there you have it. This is why too much insulin can be a problem, yet we need enough for our normal functioning. I'm Natalie Kunzman, MD. You can find me online at nataliekunzmanmd.com, where you can consult with me and we can fix a lot of these problems in a functional, holistic approach. And until we meet again, be well.